Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Reading Corner with MooseChangerPat.
That's me, in case you're wondering.
Today we are reading Chapter 15 of Magician's Gambit by David Eddings, and as always, you should support the original work by buying the original book. Chapter 15.
Is he going to be alright?
Beric asked anxiously, hovering over the still unconscious Dernick as Aunt Paul examined the large purple contusion on the side of the smith's face. "It's nothing serious," she replied in a voice seeming to droop with a great weariness. Garion sat nearby with his head in his hands. He felt as if all the strength had been wrenched out of his body. Beyond the heaped coals of the rapidly dying bonfire, Silk and Hedar were struggling to remove Mandarolin's dented breastplate. A deep crease running diagonally from shoulder to hip gave mute evidence of the force of Grull's blow, and placed so much stress on the straps beneath the shoulder plates that they were almost impossible to unfasten. "I think we're going to have to cut them," Silk said. "I pray thee, Prince Keldar, avoid that if possible," Mandarolin answered, wincing as they wrenched at the fastenings. "Those straps are crucial to the fit of the armor, and are most difficult to replace properly." "This one's coming now," Hedar grunted, prying at a buckle with a short iron rod. The buckle released suddenly, and the taut breastplate rang like a softly struck bell. "Now I can get it," Silk said, quickly loosening the other shoulder buckle. Mandarolin sighed with relief as they pulled off the dented breastplate. He took a deep breath and winced again. "Tender right here?" Silk asked, putting his fingers lightly to the right side of the knight's chest. Mandarolin grunted with pain, and his face paled visibly. "I think you've got some cracked ribs, my splendid friend," Silk told him. "You'd better have Polgara take a look." "In a moment," Mandarolin said. "My horse?" "He'll be all right," Hedar replied. "A strained tendon in his right foreleg is all." Mandarolin let out a sigh of relief. "I had feared for him." "I feared for us all there for a while," Silk said. "Our oversized playmate there was almost more than we could handle." "Good fight, though," Hedar remarked. Silk gave him a disgusted look, then glanced up at the scudding gray clouds overhead. He jumped across the glowing coals of their fire and went over to where Belgarath sat staring into the icy river. "We're going to have to get off this bar, Belgarath," he urged. "The weather's going to be bad on us again, and we'll all freeze to death if we stay out here in the middle of the river tonight." "Leave me alone," Belgarath muttered shortly, still staring at the river. "Polgara?" Silk turned to her. "Just stay away from him for a while," she told him. "Go find a sheltered place for us to stay for a few days."
"I'll go with you,"
Beric offered, hobbling to his horse. "You'll stay here," Aunt Paul declared firmly. "You creak like a wagon with a broken axle. I want to have a look at you before you get a chance to damage yourself permanently." "I know a place," Sinedra said, rising and pulling her cloak about her shoulders. "I saw it when we were coming down the river. I'll show you." Silk looked inquiringly at Aunt Paul. "Go ahead," she told him. "It's safe enough now. Nothing else would live in the same valley with an Eldrac." Silk laughed. "I wonder why. Coming, Princess?" The two of them mounted and rode off through the snow. "Shouldn't Dernick be coming around?" Garion asked his aunt. "Let him sleep," she replied warily. "He'll have a blinding headache when he wakes up." "Aunt Paul?" "Yes." "Who was that other wolf?" "My mother, Polydra." "But isn't she—" "Yes, it was her spirit." "You can do that?" Garen was stunned by the enormity of it. "Not alone," she said. "You had to help me." "Is that why I feel so—" It was an effort to even talk. "It took everything we could both raise to do it. Don't ask so many questions just now, Garen. I'm very tired, and I still have many things to do." "Is grandfather all right?" "He'll come around. Mandarolin, come here." The knight stepped over the coals at the neck of the bar and walked slowly toward her, his hand pressed lightly against his chest. "You'll have to take off your shirt," she told him, "and please sit down." About a half hour later, Silk and the princess returned. "It's a good spot," Silk reported. "A thicket in a little ravine. Water, shelter, everything we need. Is anybody seriously hurt?" "Nothing permanent." Aunt Paul was applying a salve to Beric's hairy leg.
"Do you suppose you could hurry, Polgara?" Berghast. It's a little chilly for standing around half-dressed.
Stop being such a baby, she said heartlessly. The ravine to which Silk and Sinadra led them was a short way back upriver. A small mountain brook trickled from its mouth, and a dense thicket of spindly pines filled it seemingly from wall to wall. They followed the brook for a few hundred yards until they came to a small clearing in the center of the thicket. The pines around the inner edge of the clearing, pressed by the limbs of the others in the thicket, leaned inward, almost touching above the center of the open area. Good spot, Heather looked around approvingly. How did you find it?
She did,
Silk nodded to Sinedra. The trees told me it was here, she said. Young pine trees babble a lot. She looked at the clearing thoughtfully. We'll build our fire there, she decided, pointing at a spot near the brook at the upper end of the clearing, and set up our tents along the edge of the trees just back from it. You'll need to pile rocks around the fire and clear away all the twigs from the ground near it. The trees are very nervous about the fire. They promised to keep the wind off us, but only if we keep our fire strictly under control. I gave them my word. A faint smile flickered across Heddar's hawk-like face. I'm serious, she said, stamping her little foot. Of course, Your Highness, he replied, bowing. Because of the incapacity of the others, the work of setting up the tents and building the fire pit fell largely upon Silk and Heddar. Sinadra commanded them like a little general, snapping out her orders in a clear, firm voice. She seemed to be enjoying herself immensely. Garion was sure that it was some trick of the fading light. But the trees almost seemed to draw back when the fire first flared up, though after a while they seemed to lean back in again, to arch protectively over the little clearing. Warily he got to his feet and began to gather sticks and dead limbs for the firewood. Now, Sinadra said, bustling about the fire in a thoroughly businesslike way, what would you all like for supper? They stayed in their protective little clearing for 3 days while their battered warriors and Mandarolan's horse recuperated from the encounter with the Eldrak. The exhaustion which had fallen upon Garion when Aunt Paul had summoned all his strength to help call the spirit of Peladra was largely gone after one night's sleep, though he tired easily during the next day. He found Sinadra's officiousness in her domain near the fire almost unbearable, so he passed some time helping Dernick hammer the deep crease out of Mandarolan's breastplate. After that, he spent as much time as possible with the horses. He began teaching the little colt a few simple tricks. Though he had never attempted training animals before, the colt seemed to enjoy it, although his attention wandered frequently. The incapacity of Dernick, Barrack, and Mandarolan was easy to understand, but Belgarath's deep silence and seeming indifference to all around him worried Garion. The old man appeared to be sunk in a melancholy reverie that he could not or would not shake off. Aunt Paul, Garion said finally on the afternoon of the 3rd day, you'd better do something. We'll be ready to leave soon, and Grandfather has to be able to show us the way. Right now I don't think he even cares where he is. Aunt Paul looked across at the old sorcerer, who sat on a rock staring into the fire. Possibly you're right. Come with me. She led the way around the fire and stopped directly in front of the old man. All right, Father, she said crisply. I think that's about enough. Go away, Polgara, he told her. No, Father, she replied. It's time for you to put it away and come back to the real world. That was a cruel thing to do, Paul, he said reproachfully. To Mother? She didn't mind. How do you know that? You never knew her. She died when you were born. What's that got to do with it? She looked at him directly. Father, she declared pointedly, you of all people should know that Mother was extremely strong-minded. She's always been with me, and we know each other very well. He looked dubious. She has her part to play in this just the same as the rest of us do. If you'd been paying attention all these years, you'd have realized that she's never really been gone. The old man looked around a little guiltily. Precisely, Aunt Paul said with just a hint of barb in her voice. You really should have behaved yourself, you know. Mother's very tolerant for the most part, but there were times when she was quite vexed with you. Belgarath coughed uncomfortably. Now it's time for you to pull yourself out of this and stop feeling sorry for yourself, she continued crisply. His eyes narrowed. That's not entirely fair, Polgara, he replied. I don't have time to be fair, Father. Why did you choose that particular form? He asked with a hint of bitterness. I didn't, father. She did. It's her natural form, after all. I'd almost forgotten that, he mused. She didn't. The old man straightened and drew back his shoulders. Is there any food around? He asked suddenly. The princess has been doing the cooking, Garen warned him. You might want to think it over before you decide to eat anything she's had a hand in. The next morning, under a still threatening sky, they struck their tents, packed their gear again, and rode along the narrow bed of the brook back into the river valley. Did you thank the trees, dear? Aunt Paul asked the princess. Yes, Lady Polgara, Sinedra replied, just before we left. That's nice, Aunt Paul said. The weather continued to threaten for the next 2 days, and finally the blizzard broke in full fury as they approached a strangely pyramidal peak. The sloping walls of the peak were steep, rising sharply up into the swirling snow, and they seemed to have none of the random irregularities of the surrounding mountains. Though he rejected the idea immediately, Garen could not quite overcome the notion that the curiously angled peak had somehow been constructed, that its shape was the result of conscious design. Prolgu, Belgrath said, pointing at the peak with one hand while he clung to his wind-whipped cloak with the other. How do we get up there? Silk asked, staring at the steep walls dimly visible in the driving snow. There's a road, the old man replied. It starts over there. He pointed to a vast pile of jumbled rock to one side of the peak.
We'd better hurry then, Belgarath, Beric said. This storm isn't going to improve much.
The old man nodded and moved his horse into the lead. When we get up there, he shouted back to them over the sound of the shrieking wind, we'll find the city. It's abandoned, but you may see a few things lying about. Broken pots, some other things. Don't touch any of them. The Olgos have some peculiar beliefs about Prolgu. It's a very holy place to them, and everything there is supposed to stay just where it is.
How do we get into the caves? Beric asked.
The Olgos will let us in, Belgrath assured him. They already know we're here. The road that led to the mountain top was a narrow ledge, inclining steeply up and around the sides of the peak. They dismounted before they started up and led their horses. The wind tugged at them as they climbed. In the driving snow, more pellets than flakes stung their faces. It took them 2 hours to wind their way to the top, and Garen was numb with cold by the time they got there. The wind seemed to batter at him, trying to pluck him off the ledge, and he made a special point of staying as far from the edge as possible. Though the wind had been brutal on the sides of the peak, once they reached the top, it howled at them with unbroken force. They passed through a broad arched gate into the deserted city of Prolgu, with snow swirling about them, and the wind shrieking insanely in their ears. There were columns lining the empty streets, tall, thick columns reaching up into the dancing snow. The buildings, all unroofed by time and the endless progression of the seasons, had a strange alien quality about them. Accustomed to the rigid rectangularity of the structures in other cities he had seen, Garen was unprepared for the sloped corners of Olgo architecture. Nothing seemed exactly square. The complexity of the angles teased at his mind, suggesting a subtle sophistication that somehow just eluded him. There was a massiveness about the construction that seemed to defy time, and the weathered stones sat solidly, one atop the other, precisely as they had been placed thousands of years before. Dernick seemed also to have noticed the peculiar nature of the structures, and his expression was one of disapproval. As they all moved behind a building to get out of the wind, and to rest for a moment from the exertions of the climb, he ran his hand up one of the slanted corners. Hadn't they ever heard of a plumb line? He muttered critically.
Where do we find the Olgos?
Beric asked, pulling his bearskin cloak ever tighter about him. It isn't far, Belgrath answered. They led their horses back into the blizzard-swept streets past the strange pyramidal buildings. An eerie place, Mandaron said, looking around him. How long hath it been abandoned thus? Since Torak cracked the world, Belgrath replied. About 5,000 years. They trudged across a broad street, through the deepening snow to a building somewhat larger than the ones about it, and passed inside through a wide doorway surmounted by a huge stone lintel. Inside, the air hung still and calm. A few flakes of snow drifted down through the silent air, sifting through the narrow opening at the top, where the roof had been slightly dusting the stone floor. Belgrath moved purposefully to a large black stone in the precise center of the floor. The stone was cut in such a way as to duplicate the truncated pyramid shape of the buildings in the city, angling up to a flat surface about 4 feet above the floor. "Don't touch it," he warned them, carefully stepping around the stone.
Is it dangerous?
Beric asked. "No," Belgrath said. "It's holy. The Ulgos don't want it profaned. They believe that Ul himself placed it here." He studied the floor intently, scraping away the thin dusting of snow with his foot in several places. "Let's see," he frowned slightly. Then he uncovered a single flagstone that seemed slightly different colored than from those surrounding it. "Here we are," he grunted. "I always have to look for it. Give me your sword, Beric." Wordlessly, the big man drew his sword and handed it to the old sorcerer. Belgrath knelt beside the flagstone he'd uncovered, and rapped sharply on it 3 times with the pommel of Beric's heavy sword. The sound seemed to echo hollowly from underneath. The old man waited for a moment, then repeated his signal. Nothing happened. A 3rd time, Belgrath hammered his 3 measured strokes on the echoing flagstone. A slow grinding sound started in one corner of the large chamber. "What's that?" Silk demanded nervously. "The Ulgos," Belgrath replied, rising to his feet and dusting off his knees. "They're opening the portal to the caves." The grinding continued, and a line of faint light appeared suddenly, about 20 feet out from the east wall of the chamber. The line became a crack, and then slowly yawned wider, as a huge stone in the floor tilted up, rising with a ponderous slowness. The light from below seemed very dim. "Belgrath," a deep voice echoed from beneath the slowly tilting stone. "Yadha Grajo Ul." "Yadha Graja Ul Vadmer Ishun," Belgrath responded formally.
Vidmo, Belgrath, Mar Ishum Ulgo,
the unseen speaker said. "What was that?" Garen asked in perplexity. "He invited us into the caves," the old man said. "Shall we go down now?"